glad you did again after my last visit here. And today my talking is about capitalism making. In China, this word also means reform. And in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, it's called transition. I'm going to talk about political consequences of capitalism making in China, Russia, and Central Europe, and do a comparison and try to find out what different types of capitalism making produce different political consequences. There is a conventional understanding about transition. Usually people think that transition from state socialism is a one-way path toward market economy and democracy. And usually people also think that market transition will be accompanied or followed by democratization. In terms of the interaction between market transition and political transformation in former socialist countries, eventually there are at least three scenarios. The first one was suggested by scholars in Eastern Europe or Central European countries. They suggest that democratization must go first. Otherwise, without democratization, privatization or market transition is going to become a spontaneous privatization. That is, bureaucrats or communist cadres get rich through privatization. However, another two scenarios say no. The second and third scenarios based on China's model disagree with that, the first scenario. The second scenario says that, well, market transition does help political transformation because market transition can reduce or weaken the political power of communist elite. Therefore, after market transition, there will appear a democratization. But the opposite scenario, with the second one, the third one says, no, China doesn't need democratization because democratization is going to weaken state capacity, and that hurts or damages marketization. The case they usually compare is Russia and China. A typical argument is Russia takes shock therapy and China takes gradualism strategy, and that's why Russia failed and China succeeded. The second and the third scenario I just mentioned didn't respond to the argument in the first scenario, that is about the spontaneous privatization. So if in China's market transition there was no spontaneous privatization, we would say, okay, we can reject the first scenario and say we can either buy the second or the third scenario. That means either China will have a democratization or China doesn't need a democratization. My key argument today is that capitalism making is not identical in transition societies. There are at least three patterns of capitalism making. I try to identify in this way. The first capitalism making, I call it capitalism without nomenclatura. Nomenclatura is a Russian word, means communist cadres on the list of the Communist Party's organization department. This capitalism without nomenclatura is observed in Central European countries, that is Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. And the second capitalism making is, I call it comrade capitalism. That's in Russia, where you'll find that the current capitalists are former communist elite. However, they are no longer Communist Party members. And the third pattern called communist capitalism. Probably if you read some Marx Karl Marx works. You may hate that word, my term, because Marx doesn't like it. However, that's my topic today. Why I call China communist capitalism. I think on the communist capitalism in China reinforces the rule of the Communist Party, and its future political change may not necessarily be democratization. Instead, there is another possibility. I call it a war or a fight among Marxists. In other words, it might be a fight of poor Marxists against rich Marxists. So now I'm going to go further to analyze the privatization in China and a contrast to that of Russia. So why I have to analyze privatization? Because this is the most important part of market transition. And during this period, we can observe how public properties were privatized by who became new owners of former public properties, and how this process affects economy, society, and politics. And also, in this analysis, we can test how political role of the current government affects the privatization process. And from that dimension, we can identify whether the authoritarian government works better or weaker than a democratized government. And especially, I have to mention that in the field of China studies, privatization in China is a missing topic, unfortunately. For many years, it was done 10 years ago. But so far, there are some economists did analysis from economic data, but nobody did any political or sociological analysis about it. And why I take Russia as reference, because usually by Russian and Russian scholars and by Chinese scholars as well, many believe that Russia is a poor model. I just mentioned earlier, because Russia chose the shock therapy, and its privatization was dominated by insiders. Therefore, that's why Russia failed its economic transition, and China did much better. I will try to convince that actually the fact is the opposite. First of all, I will talk something about the precondition of privatization in both Russia and China. Precondition one is political development. Political development in Russia and China before privatization was completely opposite. In Russia, the political liberalization of Gorbachev's policy initiated the nationwide labor movement against nomenclature. That kind of political atmosphere favored workers rather than managers. But in China, after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, political atmosphere became the opposite one. The thaw was over. And the whole atmosphere for privatization favored managers rather than workers. And precondition two, the attitudes of workers and managers in Russia and China are exactly opposite. In Russia, managers worry about the results of privatization and they oppose to that because they wonder they might be losers. And the Russian workers, on the contrary, they thought there might be an opportunity, they become the kind of new owners, or if you use Karl Marx term, the master of production. Russian workers believe that. But in China, the situation completely opposite. Chinese managers think this is a rare opportunity for us to get rich. But Chinese workers resist to privatization because they know that they are going to be losers. And precondition 3, in both countries, privatization was based on urgent need, not a well-planned program. Urgent need in Russia is that because of the nationwide labor movement against nomenclatura, the Russian Yeltsin regime had to initiate privatization immediately in order to prevent spontaneous privatization. And in China, it's different. The urgent need was that the Chinese state-owned enterprise system failed and caused great economic losses, and that made the state banking system fall into a crisis, a potential crisis. Therefore, the Chinese government decided we have to have a privatization now in 1997. And precondition 4, in both countries, neither managers or workers are able to buy the enterprises. Therefore, Russian government distribute vouchers to workers and managers in order to buy those enterprises. But in China, the government distribute nothing, but it gives managers an opportunity that do whatever you want. Now, the next is the privatization process itself. First of all, the duration of privatization in Russia and China is almost the same. In Russia, it was 1992 to 1995. And in China, it was started in 1997 or 1998 to 2002. And in both countries, most state-owned enterprises were privatized. The difference is the policy formation of privatization in the two countries. In Russia, the government prepared a transparent voucher privatization program for all its state-owned enterprises, and special government offices were set up to supervise and approve the transactions of public properties. But in China, no such plan at all. The government never prepared such a plan. And there was an existing government office was responsible to supervise state assets. But right after the privatization started, the Chinese government shut down the only government office. Therefore, the privatization in China was conducted without any supervision. And another issue is who was able to decide the privatization program of each enterprises. In Russia, the government offered workers the power. You have rights to decide if you want to sell your enterprise to outsiders or to yourself. And the managers doesn't have determinate vote. But in China, the privatization program of each enterprise was simply made behind closed doors by managers and local government officials. Therefore, in the privatization process, the outlines for privatization in Russia and China is different. In Russia, it was workers and managers work together against outside investors. But in China, it was managers and government officials work together against workers. I try to analyze the privatization methods and found I analyzed about 130 cases of privatization in China. And I found that a basic approach for managers to get their enterprises was called MBO, Management Buyout. It's a word for business students here in this country. It was used in the West, but in China it's different. Eventually, it's a method that the government offers managers the power that you can sell as an agent of government for this enterprise. You can sell your enterprise to yourself without personal investment. The approach is basically this way. As a manager, I use my enterprise as a guarantee, borrow a loan from banks or from individuals. Then I get shares. Then I use my enterprise fund to pay back. Therefore, I become owner, but I pay nothing. So one might become millionaire or billionaire overnight. Many people think China has absorbed a huge amount of FDI, foreign direct investment. Does that help privatization? No. FDI play a very small, or less than 5% role in privatization, so it could be ignored. And in terms of layoff, in China, in order to carry out privatization, the Chinese government encouraged managers lay off their workers. Therefore, about half of state SOE workers were laid off. But in Russia, there was no such cases. Eventually, the workers kept their jobs during privatization. So, now, how about the results of privatization in two countries? First of all, in both countries, it took almost the same period, duration. 5 years for China, 4 years for Russia. And in China, there was a large-scale layoff, but in Russia, there was no such thing. And the unemployment rate in Russia didn't go up during the privatization period. And the most important thing is about the change of ownership structure. In Russia, insiders held 53% of shares in year 2000, of which managers held 18% and workers held 35%. In China, the percentage looks like the same. That is, insiders held 57% of shares in year 2006, of which managers held 47% and workers 10%. But when workers held 10%, they were not real shareholders because they were forced by managers to invest by the shares. Otherwise, they're going to lose their jobs. And after that, the manager says, well, you don't have the rights of shareholders. I'm the owner. So you're just workers. So that's different. Obviously, Chinese managers are paying much more shares than their Russian counterpart and the Chinese workers. The Russian workers got more shares than the Chinese counterpart. The role of the state. The authoritarian state of China actually was weak in regulating privatization, but was stronger or tougher to suppress workers' protests. But the weak Russian regime was stronger in regulating privatization than its Chinese counterpart. So, from this case, we can find that the role of authoritarian regime is not necessarily strong in privatization. It could be much weaker than the democratization or democratic regime. And also, the labor conflicts and protests increased rapidly in China and decreased in Russia. So that's a complete different results. And the Chinese managers were supported by governments against workers' resistance. But Russian managers did not have these opportunities. And finally, if we ask the question, who paid the costs of the failure of state socialism? In Russia, its political responsibility was left over to the former Soviet regime. And its economic outcome became the responsibility of the owners, worker owners or manager owners of those enterprises. But in China, the communist regime asked workers to pay the social economic costs of the failure of state socialism. You have to be laid off. You have to receive a lower wage or lose your Medicare, medical services. But the government allowed managers have an opportunity to get better off or get rich. I would like to further explain the three patterns of capitalism making and to draw some lessons from the three capitalism making. The first, the making capitalism without nomenclature took place only in Central European countries. In those countries, the role of nomenclature was restrained, and they did not play active role in privatization, so they did not get rich. Their social status fell. Many of them got lost jobs. The most important thing that in those countries is privatization was linked to the founding of a post-communist national identity, and the anti-communist discourses dominate. That's their unique feature. And the common capitalist making in Russia is different significantly from the Central European model. There, in Russia, former communist managerial elite became new owners, but they are no longer Communist Party members. And they are comrades of current political elite. They are also comrades of their fellow workers. And the communist capitalism in China, eventually, those former communist managerial elite become capitalists now. They are capitalists because they are current owners of their firms. However, they are also communist capitalists because they are party secretary of their firms as well. So they play such both roles. So what lessons can we draw from the three capitalism making? Lesson one, I think democracy doesn't matter. So if without democratization, privatization may very likely become a spontaneous one, as we have seen in China. Lesson two, the shock therapy argument misleads us. Actually, I would like to say the shock therapy argument doesn't matter, because in Central European countries, there were gradualist reform strategy like in Poland, and radical shock therapy in Czech. And in Russia and China, you can identify the privatization in the two countries are both shock therapy. So you cannot use shock therapy to explain the failure of Russia or success of China. It doesn't matter. Lesson three, anti-communist democratization better serves marketization. The Central European countries succeeded because their democratization had an anti-communist agenda. Therefore, democratization with an anti-communist agenda better helps privatization. So, for example, the intellectuals in Central European countries raised three issues before privatization. Number one, purification. Number two, sacrifice. Number three, confess. Purification means you all guys need to purify your spirit, your soul. That was polluted by communist agenda, communist culture during the rule of communist regime. Number two, confess. Everyone has to confess that you were guilty because during the rule of communist regime, you did something, either directly support or compromise that. Number three, you have to sacrifice rather than to make gain from privatization or market transition. That's why in the Central European countries, there was no nomenclature of workers gave a lot, as in Russia or China. Lesson four, the Central European transition model is not applicable to Russia or China. Just because in Central European countries, revolution was imposed by Soviet tanks. But in Russia and China, revolution grew when they So the different routes of revolution decides that the transition would be different. Lesson 5, the role of authoritarian state. This argument, its role in privatization is questionable. As I mentioned earlier, when we talk about China's economic achievements, a lot of scholars emphasize that the Chinese government is authoritarian and it helps privatization and market transition. But from the analysis of China's privatization, we can find out actually the Chinese authoritarian regime was weak in privatization, not strong. In lesson 7, what is the very nature of the China model? I call it marketization against democratization. Because the communist capitalists now take a firm position against democracy because they know that as democratization comes, it will question their practices in privatization, will delegalize their properties, even may charge them with criminal activities. So democratization means a threat to their lives. So they do understand if they embrace in any way democratization, that means they may go and hand themselves. So that's why when communists become communist capitalists, they are the firm opposers of democratization. And the communist regime becomes the only umbrella that makes those communist capitalists feel safe. Therefore, the market transition in China created communist capitalism, and that communist capitalism blocked it rather than promoted democratization. And finally, I'll talk something about the future of the communist capitalism in China. I would say that probably we can consider the transition in China stopping on its halfway. Or if you observe something, you may find that even the so-called market transition has turned around toward back, turned around halfway. I'll further analyze. Before that, I would mention one thing I forgot raise, that is the evaluation of privatization in Russia and China. So if you evaluate privatization in China and Russia with 3 principles, justice, transparency, and participation, you'll find that the privatization in Russia is actually better than that of China. Now, what about China's future? I'll just follow Ming-Xin's speech yesterday and mentioned another speech of Xi Jinping, the Chinese current leader. In a different meeting, Xi Jinping said such kind of words that if first of all, we are in a critical moment now. If we could succeed, we might have a bright future. Otherwise, so the Soviets yesterday is our tomorrow. Exactly as what Ming-Xin mentioned. So Xi Jinping used different words. In other words, he worries much about that. So we have no reason to doubt the doubt of Mr. Xi. Why he would so worry about it? I think at least there are 2 challenges I would like to mention. One is the social inequality in China during the market transition heavily damaged the economy. That's a dimension that few scholars analyze this way, because usually in sociology, social injustice and inequality was a dependent variable to be analyzed rather than independent variable. But this time I'm going to use it as an independent variable to explain economic changes. Another challenge is the societal anti-elite motion. And that emotion may lead to the revolution I call the poor Marxists against rich Marxists. First of all, I would like to talk a little bit about social inequality. Why it does undermine economic stability? First of all, under the communist capitalism, the social inequality has been structured. And the structured social inequality leads to injustice of income distribution or wealth distribution between wage earners and property owners. Therefore, there is a significant indicator one can use that to find out how the injustice change economic status of this country. We all know that in GDP, there's a great part is called household consumption. So this percentage, the ratio of household consumption in GDP, could be used to measure how transition change to the wealth distribution and income distribution. Because if people get better off, most people get better off, then they will consume more. Then the percentage goes up. If most people get worse off, relatively, then the percentage goes down. Now I'll give you a few numbers so you can judge for yourself. Eventually, in developing or in the market, industrial societies, this percentage is high. And in developing countries, it's lower. And we just mentioned that in the transition society, it is supposed to go high or stable, but not supposed to be a decline. Now, here is the fact. In the United States and Japan, the ratio of household consumption in GDP is 70% and remains stable. In India, developing country, 57. In Russia, during the transition period, it was 58 to 60, stable. In China, before reform started in 1978, it was 48 in 1978. And after the rural reform, it went up to 51. However, it went down when urban reform began. So before the privatization, it was 45. And after privatization, 42. And that's 2003. And how about 2010? 34. If you check data of World Bank or IMF, you'll find that China made a great record. No country in the world has ever had such a kind of record. This percentage dropped so rapidly during the so-called successful market transition from 48% to 34%. Almost like this. That means a country with a huge population, 1.3 billion, could not consume more. Actually, in a comparison with Chinese elite, they consume much less. As a result, the consumption of this population could only sustain 1/3 of China's growth. So if China does not export more and more and more, China has to rely upon other things, that is investment. And then now that's what we have seen. China's economy is being moved from consumption toward real estate bubble. That's why today, in financial circle, many people are talking about Japanese real estate bubble. Okay. So, as a result, local governments play much more role in manipulating the real estate development, and the Chinese economy turns back toward a decentralized planning economy. And I'll just say a few words about the anti-unity motion. Eventually, China now is dominated, its cyberspace is dominated by, I call it, poor, educated people. They hate elite, including intellectual elite. And the middle class in China now loses their influence. However, the poor people were indoctrinated by classical Marxist indoctrination. Therefore, they were armed and are armed and will be armed by Marxist and Maoist revolutionary ideas. So they don't know democracy, but they know how to initiate revolution, how to grab the properties of others, no matter those properties are legally received or not. Doesn't matter, they just want a revolution. So, a possible anti-communist uprising may not necessarily be democratization. If by such kind of social group, without introduction of democratic ideas, there might be another revolution of Marxists against poor Marxists against rich Marxists. Thank you very much.